Hello, and welcome back to Platform Enterprise, a podcast for people who are pissed off with capitalism. I'm your host, Rachel Donald. I'm an investigative journalist and a writer. You can find some of my work over at platformenterprise.com, where, most importantly, you can sign up to get these podcast episodes delivered straight to your inbox every week. On this week's episode is David Anderson. David runs this fantastic nonprofit called Simbi, which facilitates an alternative economy. He calls it a barter-esque marketplace, and essentially what it is people can sign up to exchange with one another, and they can either exchange services or exchange Simbi credits. This is kind of what crypto could have been and should have been, and hopefully will continue to be, a facilitation for people to build relationships, to strengthen their community, and not to replace the dollar, he says, but to work alongside our normal currencies because, frankly, they're scarce for many of us. And so if some people can save 100 euros or dollars or pounds working with Simbi credits and working with people in their community, then hopefully the money they save can go towards food or rent or these necessities. I think you guys will really, really love it. There's a lot of shout outs to Brett Scott and to David Graeber throughout. It's kind of becoming a theme on the podcast. So before you go, please leave our conversation a 5-star rating on whatever podcast app you're listening on, and also leave us a comment to let us know what you think. All right, everyone, enjoy the show. So, David, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for reaching out. You're like the first person that's contacted me to be on the show, so I feel a little bit like a celebrity. So it's which episode was it that got you thinking? Is it Brett's?
Yeah.
The one about what money really means?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Brett Scott's, and so when I saw his podcast, I was like, oh, that fits perfectly for Simbi.
Oh, excellent. And did it all make sense, everything that he was saying? I think I had to ask like at different points. I was like, can you just clarify? Can you just repeat that for my brain?
Yeah, I mean that's his whole specialty is diving into things that like are really hard to explain and thus like have thrown most people off in terms of what they mean and how they work and how to deal with it. So like actually taking the time to let him expand on it for an hour plus is really, really helpful, I think, in general.
Oh, cool. Have you applied his philosophy to Simbi at all?
Absolutely. I would say I was already kind of on the same track when I was beginning to work on Simbi. And so it just so happens that I kind of agreed with a lot of his philosophy. It's just that he's done a lot of the like internal investigation of the finance system to kind of like confirm a lot of the things that I had been assuming along the way, probably, and a lot of the design decisions that were going into Simbi at the time. For sure.
Oh, excellent. I love that, the collective subconsciousness when people find people on the other side of the world working on the same things. I think it gives me hope for the state of the future.
Yeah. Well, he's one of the few people who makes me feel not crazy because you're always kind of bouncing new ideas off of yourself and other people and trying to figure out exactly what makes sense. And I had been working in the kind of super alternative side of currency, like not even crypto, like community currency and very, very alternative, I guess is the best phrase. But being able to connect that work at a very community level to what is happening philosophically and practically at the level of the financial system is really important because people don't really get into alternative economies until they not only see the problem with the current economy, but if they see the problem or see a problem and don't really define the problem correctly, then they end up with all kinds of really crazy solutions that a lot of times end up reinforcing similar problems or even the same problems directly. And that's why it's really important when people like Brett talk about Bitcoin and crypto and things like that to frame them correctly as still within the existing monetary system, because all of them are priced in dollars and will remain priced in dollars unless they're used as an actual medium of exchange at some point. So I think it's really hard to connect all of the different things that you have to connect to be able to have a coherent alternative monetary message. And so Brett's one of the only people I know. He's still struggling with figuring out exactly how to do it in the most effective way possible, and that's why he's got like a lot of like artistic YouTube videos and things like that. But that's just the facts, that it's so complex that you can't really get a real picture of it without resorting to non-simple imagery.
Yes, absolutely. Everything you just said. Yes. And I think I know it's been sort of disappointing for like the well, for some of the crypto community, so maybe the people that were there at the beginning, how it's been sort of capitalized on and just made into a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly it's a shame that like the crypto that rolls off the tongue for your layman is also so environmentally destructive. And that kind of takes away from, I think, having looked at the white paper, not read all of it, but it wasn't birthed for that. And certainly the majority of people working on alternative economy projects is to serve the community rather than to line somebody's pockets.
Yeah, and I do think Bitcoin especially illustrates what I was describing, where if you don't get the monetary theory exactly right, then anything you try to do is going to eventually screw up in some of the same ways. And so when Brett was describing Bitcoin as a super conservative monetary theory, it really is. If you go through the white paper, there's all sorts of things in the white paper as far as the like economic assumptions of how it works that are kind of laughable on face if you're really looking at the whole monetary perspective. And so I think it was just kind of a natural response that people, if they're not seeing those issues and they kind of come to take the economic assumptions in the white paper as gospel, then they don't even realize that they end up inheriting this super conservative monetary philosophy of money just being an asset, and and there being like a right way to an obvious simple right way to do it, like 21 million bitcoins, simple, right? Like no, that's not useful. It may be simple, but it's certainly not useful. um, so yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for really accepting the necessary nuance of money, because Bitcoin just simplifies it down to say, oh, the banks are doing this terrible thing, and so let's us do this terrible thing the same way. Essentially, it's still
Power to the people.
well, it's power to the people, but it's like power to the first people who get in and
Yeah.
screw everybody else, and like that doesn't create it may be fairer in the way that it's created, because anybody potentially could be one of the first people in if they're like clever and smart enough to and lucky enough to be there, but that doesn't actually mean it's a significantly better system than the way money is distributed now. I like you can see a system as bad and come up with a response to it, and that response be almost as bad or just as bad and not actually solve the issues you're thinking about.
I had a guest on months ago who used this fantastic phrase that stuck with me, crisis of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a nice moment to segue into, how have you, before we go into introduce your project, how difficult is it to imagine new systems or new ways of trading with each other or using money, given how embedded we are in a very conservative monetary system?
I mean, I think it's obviously super difficult because very few people do it, right? I mean, the fact that crypto has blown up as much as it has shows that there really is like a latent understanding that money isn't serving us the way that it could. And so when I criticize crypto and all the shortcomings and the lack of forethought that's put into a lot of the projects, it's like coming from a good place in terms of like them realizing that the existing financial system doesn't serve us. But at the same time, like usually people like get to the level of like, oh man, they just print dollars out of thin air. Well, that's not fair. Let's find a way for me to print dollars out of thin air. And that's like literally where the conversation ends. Um, so like you really do need to explore the nuance of how everything possibly could work in order to like build a systems perspective to have any kind of chance of like accurately evaluating these types of issues and like really deciding if any particular currency design is going to be useful. Like it takes like pulling from a lot of disciplines, not just like one very obvious worldview. Like the only people working on this are people who have the ability to like make counter arguments to themselves and be intellectually honest about it constantly. You know, like if you have a
Mm.
dog in the fight, you're never going to have a useful perspective for the most part.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's why I think Brett is so useful as an example, is because he's like not in any of those fights. He doesn't, you know, he may own some crypto or something possibly, but I really don't think he does, to be honest. Like, you know, he's stayed out of all of that, and you know, his kind of like bona fides about it are pretty like not challengeable for the most part,
Mm.
because he's like, it's just so easy when anyone else is who is tied to crypto is talking about it. It's like, okay, I get that you don't want to, you've invested a lot in this and you don't want to, you know, go to zero, but it's like that's too much of the motivation if you're like, because otherwise you have to like dig super deeply into it and acknowledge that there are like certain things about each side that you really have to deal with. Like, and that's not, you don't see that happening too much on the, it's just, you know, so you asked originally about the crisis of imagination. It seems like there was a lot of imagination being put into all of these new DeFi and crypto projects. The problem is that like the imagination is a pretty surface level imagination. It for the most part. It's like taking a lot of the same assumptions about money that everyone has and um, just making like slightly cooler designed or like more collectible tokens than than
Mm.
they were before, but it's not actually necessarily doing anything. So hopefully Simbi like starts to address some of the issues there, and you know, we're not perfect yet because it's super complex, but that's the goal, is to have Simbi be an example of a community currency that doesn't fall into any of those traps, and you make other trade-offs too in order to do that. But I think for like the long term picture of how a community currency or a small alternative economy grows, you kind of have to like, you're always going to have trade-offs. It's choosing the most important trade-offs for long-term viability.
I think it's a good time to introduce Simbi,
Yeah,
what it is, how long you've been working on it, etc.
sure. So Simbi is an online, most people think of it as a bartering marketplace for people on anywhere in the world. There is a virtual currency on the site that allows people to not have to barter directly, but can, you know, they can sell their services or time for Simbi credits and then use those later. So it's got like all of the basic aspects of a full-fledged alternative economy, like to not use dollars. It's theoretically possible that someone could just live entirely on Simbi if they had enough people in a community around them also using Simbi. Um, but it's not really intended to fully replace dollars. It's more intended to give everyone an option to be able to get certain things from people they may not necessarily know without using dollars that they may want to keep to spend on rent or food or other things that they can only get for dollars. So that was the original kind of push for Simbi, was this idea that like dollars are very scarce. Our talents and services are not as scarce as the dollars that we are forced to use to transact them, and thus it totally makes sense to have a like expanded barter-esque economy. You can use a virtual currency easily, but it makes sense to have that extra economy on top of dollars to ease some of that scarcity.
Okay. Before we get into exactly how it works,
Hmm.
the bartering aspect, do you think that that's a step towards a direction in which people will just eventually help each other out in their communities, or do you want it to stay barter-esque?
I think it's kind of a distinction without a difference. Like people will only barter if it's like helping themselves and helping someone else at the same time, and there's nothing about that that like makes people not feel generous or willing to give other gifts. I think there's a lot of like misinformation around how, or kind of inaccurate history around what barter means, and people think of it as a very like direct transaction based, like I'm only going to do this if they meet my price kind of thing. But like historically, barter has been much more of a credit arrangement, even among people who don't live in the same community. Like they're not always just like giving one for one. There's often been credit involved, and so I don't think it's like I don't think it's something that drives anyone in any particular direction. There's like a lot of gray area when people are actually being in an economy or actually participating in an economy.
All right.
Yeah.
I just asked that because I read recently, well, not so recently now, David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years.
Yeah, one of my favorite books.
I can hear that in what you're saying. But I did find it very interesting to learn that tokens did not necessarily equate to any kind of cash for a long time, that things are traded in terms of relationships or to represent things. And so it's just nice to clarify that, because when I hear barter, I think of kind of what he explained as barter in the first part, which is that, economists have thought that trading and bartering was the extent of human relationships in an economy, and that's just not true.
Right.
It was used to build relationships.
Yeah,
and that's obviously what you're aiming for.
Absolutely. And it can still be the former because people don't have to know each other. They can just exchange one to one, but in reality what happens is people actually do build relationships over time, especially if they exchange multiple times or whatever. So that like it the strict myth of barter is what Graeber was addressing there. Like this idea that everyone just like traded because that was the only way to do things, when in fact it's obviously not the only way to do things. You can just give credit to someone at any time that you want. You can be as generous as you want and expect as much as you want in return at any time, and there's no limits to how that should work within human nature whatsoever. And the kind of like simplistic idea of homo economicus, like economic man, is that like that never there's never any variation there, that everyone is always just like making strict calculations, and that's not actually how it works at all. Like I'm sure that even Graeber would have said that like people will occasionally just barter whenever, and they're like, oh, I have this right now and you have this right now, but it just happens to be a coincidence of needs, and 90% of the time you don't have an exact direct coincidence of needs, and you're going to issue credit to your friend, or the person or the merchant that you just met who's at the trading post with you. Like there's it's never as like obviously simple as the story is told. And I think that was Graeber's like great contribution, was like, no, this is not simple at all. This is, there's many different types of money and many different things that we may not even understand as money that was like still representing value to other people. And I think Simbi can take pieces of that also. Like there is the direct virtual currency, but also there, like internally within Simbi, there's like a reputation system that kind of like gets more at what Graeber was talking about in terms of like how people would issue credit to each other. Like the most generous person is the most well known and will obviously be taken care of because they have been being generous for so long for so many people. And so like it's getting into that level of complexity that is, I think, more interesting for humanity.
What I like that it addresses is the problem of volunteering, which is that it's a typically very middle class and up thing to do, because not everybody has endless time to give to a cause. Or to give to an organization or whatever. And volunteering is a very tricky philosophical, economic and philosophical thing. And so I actually like it that you can exchange these credits on the Simbi marketplace to one another, because it gives a form of value that somebody can then use to go and fulfill their needs, rather than just expecting everybody to live off of their soul being filled up on their own good deeds.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, like people can't right now buy food or like get a room to rent or something using their Simbi credits. But the idea that volunteers can be rewarded by the good, the charities and the folks with a good mission that they're volunteering for, is a super powerful concept. Just to like, for those people to be able to, who are getting that work done, to be able to give a reward that is useful out of nothing. And the interesting analogy there, to go back to like everyone getting mad at the banks for printing money out of nothing and deciding to do Bitcoin instead, is that like, okay, you can see how money works right now, and there's actually like a pretty useful analogy for how like what that means in Simbi's case is like these nonprofits are essentially banks in the Simbi system. They're a level below Simbi as an organization, like on the platform, but they can make credits essentially out of nothing to give to volunteers for doing good work, and then those volunteers can go get things that they would need on the Simbi platform and kind of extend the economy.
Oh, I thought it was just sort of one to one, like person to person, but there's NGOs involved as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or
So it previously, historically, has always been just individuals, one to one, and the only way credits were created on the system were as essentially sign up bonuses. So it's pretty equivalent to a like credit limit in a time bank that you might have, or another community currency where the system just has a rule that no one can go below negative 100 credits or something, and that's how you make sure people aren't taking advantage of the system. In Simbi, it's essentially the same thing, except that negative 100 credits is zero, and people can get positive credits for their, making a good profile and having a profile picture and things that contribute to their participation in the community, up to a small limit, like it's like 150, I think, total Simbi credits that someone can get if they do all the things, right? And so that creates an initial credit balance in the system historically. That's the way Simbi credits were always created. What we've done recently, as we've switched Simbi to a nonprofit, is to layer on a new way to create Simbi credits, which is for nonprofit organizations to create them by paying volunteers. And so as time goes on, the proportion of new Simbi credits made by that method will go up, and the proportion made by sign-up bonuses will go down. And as long as you're like transparent about how those are being created the whole time, then it's like totally fine, as long as everyone can see that. And there is like a Simbi economy page that you can see exactly how many credits are being created at any given time, that kind of thing. So that's like Simbi's, I would say, like a slight innovation in the community currency model, because it allows people to talk about their Simbi credits. And when people say, oh, is that backed by anything? Like, when people are using a asset backed or resource backed mentality, like Bitcoin or gold or things like that, then you can immediately say to them, yeah, it's backed by volunteer effort. Like this Simbi credit was created because someone volunteered for a nonprofit for X amount of time, or did this thing, which gives like a real describable quote unquote backing to your virtual currency, but it doesn't actually function as a backing. Like you can't go redeem it for anything that is directly related to how it was created. You can't go back to the nonprofit and get them to give you, a shelter bed or something, at least not yet. But it does give this like much more easy to understand story of where the currency comes from and how it relates to its users in the system.
because presumably, before you introduced this, there would have been a cap on how many credits could be in a system at any given time. If 150 was the maximum that somebody could earn. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So
and now
it could, it could go up. You're right. Like if people do a ton of volunteering, you could have a lot more credits entering the system. And all that means is like there was a lot of work done in the system, and those people are like have the ability to get work or other things for themselves because of that. It's like, you can track the velocity of that money very easily as it moves through the system.
That's interesting. Which NGOs or charities have you got to sign up with you?
Some pretty small ones so far. The Berkeley Zen Center was one of the first ones that joined. A couple of other like spiritual-esque ones. There's one actually that was going to be the person that I platform at the end of this, or the organization I platform at the end of this. They're called Community Development Finance. Really cool organization. But yeah, just pretty much anyone who has a need to get volunteer work and doesn't have a good system for doing that already is perfect for the system. Right now it's kind of optional if they're fully registered charities. Like we do an individual check to make sure that they're actually a project with like a good mission. But eventually at scale, we'll probably have to restrict it to like registered charities.
God, that is really, really interesting.
Thank you.
That is an innovation. Yeah. Tell me, how has activity been over lockdown? Have you found that people are helping each other out more?
Yeah, Simbi has had a lot more users, a lot more members back in 2017 kind of era. So its actual history is it was founded as a for-profit startup that went through the Y Combinator startup school program, raised
Yeah.
a couple $1 million from Silicon Valley investors, built the platform essentially from scratch, and mostly used advertising to get a ton of new members early on. And the idea at the time was just to get a massive network of people and then figure out how to monetize it for, investors later. And the massive network of people that they got to before running out of money was about 180,000 people.
Wow.
Yeah, so there was tons and tons of activity, while there was kind of like investment in customer support and a lot of the kind of like high touch areas of maintaining a community like that. Um, but unfortunately, like they didn't find a way to monetize in time and had to kind of uh, potentially were looking at shutting it down. I was a consultant on the currency design originally back in like 2014, 2015 when they were first starting to work on the project. And I ended up not continuing to work on it because I thought that it should be a nonprofit legal structure. And, I thought it would be kind of have a better future that way long term. But then fast forward 5 or 6 years, and it didn't work as a nonprofit or as a for-profit. And luckily, I had another client at the time who was working on building a community currency, who had the resources to just say, you know what, let's just grab Simbi, stop working on building this new one, and see if we can revive Simbi. And then over the last year or two, I've worked with him to convert it to a nonprofit. We'll start a new nonprofit, transfer Simbi into that, and kind of like get its life started as a nonprofit. So long story short, the 180,000 people who joined previously could be reinvited, but in the time since Simbi was no longer being invested in terms of like team, customer support, that kind of thing, that ended late 2017, early 2018. So since then, there have been a lot less people using Simbi on a regular basis over and over until we've kind of have started to revive it again. So right now, it's a community of about a couple thousand people a month, for the most part, and a lot of those people are people who have like still use it from like 5 years ago and had been using it for things that whole time. So we know like the core model is useful for people, and we just kind of have to like create an organic growth strategy rather than a paid growth strategy, essentially.
Well, I mean, that's great though, because if you've had people stick with you from the beginning through all of that, then as you say, like, the model works. You just need to find the kind of people that would be interested in this, or, try and re-on board
Yeah, exactly.
the
And
other
and
hundred
there's
odd
and
thousand.
there's a lot to fine tune, no question about it. But we're constantly adding new features to it. Like we literally just added internationalization 2 days ago, like the ability to
Oh.
read Simbi in any language, and have set that as your default language and have that always translate for you. So hopefully that can make it easier for international users to jump on and be able to communicate effectively. We know that there are certain communities that we do want to target at some point, like Spanish speakers in the U.S. Are perfect for this type of platform. Like a lot of them really need something like this, and not necessarily non-English speakers, but we've also been working with people who use other exchanges for community currencies in other countries, who are either tired of like old software that isn't getting updated and want to switch over to Simbi, that type of thing. So we're excited about that, but it's going to continue to require like tweaking exactly how the platform works because every community currency is different that people are using right now.
Like, the first thing I want to know is why from the beginning you thought it would work best as a non-profit.
So So it goes back to my experience in as a social entrepreneur. My first business was a network of environmental blogs, and our goal was to try and pay the writers as much as possible within that system. So we created a rev share system where we ran the whole network on like 30% of the revenue, and every other dollar was passed down to the editorial teams. This may seem disconnected, but it made me realize that like you're always making a trade-off between the what you're investing in and your investors' need for return if you're in a for-profit situation, no matter what. So like we were looking at like this pool of ad money that was coming in every month, and I knew that I could basically do whatever I wanted at the top level to be able to keep writers around. And it turns out by far the best thing to do is just be 100% transparent about how much money is coming in and give them most of it. Like that's what motivates people, you know. And if you like bring it back into this version of things, like into the digital currency world, this the same concept basically applies. If there is any profit motive attached to the project, then it's going to affect how that like your incentives that you're creating within the project. And sometimes that works fine if you're like making shoes to sell or some, you know, there's some like product based reason why that just like totally makes sense. But in Simbi's case, there really is no direct good reason for it, and it's only a drag on your decision making as an organizer or as an entrepreneur, because you're eventually going to hit a situation where you can either do something good for your community or do something that your investor wants you to do. Bottom line.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and it doesn't mean that the investor is like being mean or bad or anything. It's just it creates these kind of like structural incentives in the like on your cap table of the company that like you have to respond to.
Yeah.
And so especially in situations where there's like a lot of maybe innovation is one word, but like especially in the like alternative currency world, there's like I think it's very unhealthy for it to be a for-profit situation. Like I've never seen a situation where like the users benefited from the you know, early adopters or investors or whoever you want to like the core insiders. Like the I've never seen the rest of the users also benefit from the core insiders benefiting. It's like a zero when you're looking at currency systems, especially Bitcoin or like the obvious ones. They're all zero sum games, and some of them are negative sum games. Like Bitcoin on its face is a zero sum game, but the fact, like you mentioned previously, the environmental impacts of that, and like literally just like the cost to create Bitcoin makes it into a negative sum game, not just like even, but like bad. So you know, and so I think like that's what you have to look at first, and then you can kind of like build your plan on top of that. And I think people just ignore that.
All right. So, what would you say then to that wonderful old adage that profit drives innovation, or capitalism drives innovation?
I think there is merit to the basic idea, but I don't think it like is the like brain exploding smartest idea in the world, because I think it's really clear that oftentimes profit drives copycats and a lack of innovation. Like you can point to examples all over the place where capitalism is incredibly inefficient at creating actual innovation. Like just walk down the aisle at the grocery store and there's 37 different cereals that are exactly the same, and no one has come up with a better new cereal in 50 years. Like there's no like it doesn't produce innovation in everything. It's just the fact that like it is a real thing that some people want to get rich and so become very interested in doing anything they need to do in order to do that, and sometimes really good innovation will come out of that, right? Like that, like that's I think it's hard to deny that that like has happened in the past. You know, like Henry Ford comes to mind as like a really strong example of that potentially, but like he also liked Nazis. So like you know, like not everybody is like you know, there's there's rationality and there's also like values, and they're always constantly intersecting. So I don't know.
Well, I think we can often say that need drives innovation. Perhaps that's the foundation underneath all of it, because if somebody wants to get rich, maybe that's because of some perceived need as well.
Sure.
And so what maybe Simbi is doing is providing people a platform in which to serve each other's needs without sacrificing that of another in order to get there.
That's a really good way to put it. I don't think I've ever heard someone put it that way before, but it does really address the underlying idea that dollars are enforcing artificial scarcity on us, and the fact that there's so much more abundance like in people's skills and assets and everything than there are dollars to go around, is reflected in that statement for sure.
I saw that a lot on your website. The word abundance came up a lot.
Hmm.
At first, I thought it might be some kind of like, hippie California meaning of the word.
I think that's how it
Um,
started out for sure.
but it's true. I mean, the problem with, dollars is that, there are enough dollars to go around. They're just not going to go around in the current system.
Yeah, I
Um,
guess you could technically say there are enough dollars sitting somewhere to go around. They're just people
I
don't
think we know where they're
have an
sitting.
experience of having enough dollars to go around. But yeah, the original company name for Simbi was Abundance Labs Incorporated. So the founder of Simbi really liked the concept of abundance and the idea of abundance, and she had a yoga studio in Northern California, where to go back to the hippie thing,
Yeah.
so that's where the idea for Simbi came from, was that she was bartering all these services for space in her yoga studio. She was getting like plumbers and painters and people to do things for space in her yoga classes. And she was like, why isn't there a platform to do this? And so that was the original kind of founding spark of realizing like, hey, these dollars are restricting the abundance that exists between me and the other people in my community, rather than facilitating the flow of those things.
You said at the beginning that you don't envision Simbi as a currency or as a platform that could completely replace dollars or would completely replace dollars. Do you think that together with other alternative economy models that could happen in the future?
I think so. I also think that people like don't give dollars and like the international banking system enough credit for how it does facilitate a lot of really complex logistical supply chain issues. Like, I can't conceive of how Bitcoin or Simbi credits or anything like that can actually like get a computer made, or get a cell phone made. Like given how systems in the existing economy work right now, like I've never seen anyone explain the process by which that would actually work. So I think it does make sense to maintain an international financial system in some form. The question is like how
Yeah.
transparent that is, and like other like smaller, or not smaller, but like more specific issues within that. In Simbi's case, I think the ideal would be for everyone to have access to Simbi or something like it, but to use that for a relatively small percentage of their economic activity, at least at first. I would much rather have 1 million people use Simbi for 1% of their economic activity than 1,000 people use Simbi for everything they do. It would be really cool, to be honest, to see a community of 1,000 people like doing that. But I don't think that's actually really possible in the modern world, because so much of what we get is coming from very far away places, and we don't even think about it or see it. And so, like, the alternative economy system that you would have to build in order to facilitate international trade at that level, like not just trade, but the actual building of the products and doing that in multiple different countries, and all like all of the pieces that go into like our actual modern lives are very hard to replicate with a simple system we can just slap in place, like to replace what the massively complex thing that already exists that takes even people who completely understand it hours to explain. Going back to Brett's situation, and I think he
All
would probably
right.
say something similar. Is just like there's the existing systems we have are like they're complex for a reason. It's not like part of it's obfuscation and the ability for people who control it to profit in certain ways, but also those people aren't necessarily like that's not necessarily the driving original thing in the system for most of the people who are in roles that control its function. I think assigning a massive conspiracy to the hundreds of thousands or millions of people who actually run the financial system is a little tough to believe. There may be a very few people at the top who are really good at like managing everyone else's expectations. But at the same time, I think most people are just in a situation where they have systemic incentives that they have to respond to, and they probably don't really understand too much outside of what they are seeing and touching and are able to control. Like I know for a fact that's true with most of the bank managers at at the lower Federal Reserve level or anything like that. Like they are literally just looking at balance sheets and trying to keep their bank profitable, right? And by
Sure.
doing that, they are ensuring that they get their mortgage paid for and that kind of thing. But like that's not the same thing at all as a conspiracy to hold everyone down by managing an unfair money system. Like those are two different things.
Well, is it? I mean, okay. It's not. Okay, exactly what you just said would, you know, perhaps be a conspiracy, but it's not far off, though. I mean, we've lived through the economic crises of the past, coming up 14 years now. We do know that money is deliberately mismanaged in order to induce profits for people. As a journalist, I work a lot covering Malaysia, and like the amount of like corruption that goes on there in broad daylight, and people like deliberately like building political systems and building companies and just to exploit as much as they can for their own personal gain. Like it is
Oh,
happening. It really
100% happens
is.
at individual levels. I'm talking about the people at the level of designing the financial system. I think most of those people are just trying to not have the system crash. I think it's much like yes, any individual, their incentives are often are just driven by the ideal of getting super rich, and they don't really care who they step on to do that. But that's much more of like a at the lower level of the system than anyone designing or maintaining the system. Those people you're describing are just using the system, right? That's like it's like a you don't think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we've all read reports that, the bankers, capital T, capital B, were warned before 2008 that their borrowing and spending was going to lead to a global recession. They were warned, they were
Right,
told,
but
and yet they continue to do so. And it's systemic. It's not, a case of a couple of rogue individuals. And I absolutely agree that an environment and the pathologies that exist within a system will then kind of, induce that in somebody. Yes, 100%. But nevertheless, there is deliberate exploitation and abuse going on at top levels that does result in keeping a lot of people down.
totally. But I still think that's individual people responding to their individual incentives rather than anyone designing that outcome for the system. And that's the distinction I'm trying to make is that um, it's more of a tragedy of the commons situation than it is like a evil overlord who has everything figured out and is and is pulling puppet strings. The
Sure, sure, because that's incredibly disempowering. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I think that is the narrative. The reason I make such the distinction like so vividly or strongly is that I think that is the narrative that most people who get into cryptocurrency see. They just feel entirely disempowered by this like massive system that seems like it's just this shadow world that like they have no access to. And that's true. They have no access to it, and it's a massive system and it's a shadow world. But as Brett points out, it's because it's like massively complex, and people complexify in order to make more money because they can be cleverer than the next guy and make money from it. But it's constantly those people responding to the individual incentive of that original design that I think people attribute intent to the design that is having those effects. And it, may very well be like I wasn't at Jekyll Island in 1913 when they decided to establish the Federal Reserve, but like there are other explanations for why the Federal Reserve uh, should have been established than just like those nine people want to control the world because they're amazing. Like they're industrialists. They were trying to control things. They're trying to control the economy. Does that mean they had like a like broader, deeper plan from a secret society or something? I think that's where it gets into like a lot more questionable and unprovable, and that's
Yeah, yeah.
still
So
like 90% of people who question the monetary system think of it like that. It's just this like cabal that is, running things. Like there's totally a cabal, but they like go to tea parties and stuff. They're not
this is the whole like the elite are actually lizards wearing human skin, like QAnon,
yeah, if
or even that old disgusting one like the Jews run the world. That was what it was, for the 20th
and it still
century.
is, in
Um,
a lot of ways. Like that's what I'm trying to address there,
sure.
is
Okay, yes. So absolutely, we can agree on that. However, I would still argue, yeah, don't worry, we'd definitely agree on that. I would still definitely argue though that there is a middle ground of nuance and complexity and all of the shades of grey. That in fact, whilst yes, some people are kind of responding to individual needs, which we are all guilty of. I mean, the other thing is like if one were to follow the exact same life path as one of these many people that are in control, like, do you really think you would be that different? Like,
exactly.
why is it that billionaires kind of are, slightly psychopathic? Like, it's not because they're all psychopaths, it's because of whatever that does to you, having that much control or power or money or whatever. Nevertheless, I think that we can see from the webs of corruption that cover the world that whilst there aren't people controlling the world, i.e., puppeteering every individual man and our choices and our beliefs, there is definitely webs of corruption that are created to enforce exploitation and to enforce that individual need for a select few, whether it's the 1% or whether it's the elite or however you want to
For
call it.
sure. And I think the difference is that the mindset behind that is one of like almost like fatalism of like this is how it needs to be in order for me to
Mm,
survive, it needs to be this way. And it comes down to like
mm,
a mindset of scarcity in general versus a mindset of abundance in general. And if you see yourself as like this individual point in space that constantly threatened with destruction, that you have to build a set of defenses around yourself to keep the entropy at bay, and that kind of thing, then that's the natural reaction, is to take as much as you can, screw everyone else, and like it's entirely justified. There's no one who can who can tell you that like your argument is bad, because they're like, look around, like this is the
yeah,
world. There's scarcity. It's a real
yeah,
thing. Um,
yeah.
but there were
That can I just say that's an excellent
Thank you.
description, I
Yes.
think.
The opposite is there's a lot of people out there who see abundance in the world and don't see it as a fundamentally scarce thing. They see how much human connection there is, and the fact that we can take care of each other in given situations if we decide to, right? Like it's people there's a whole group of people who don't see it as a foregone conclusion that you have to be selfish in order to survive, right? Like they see everything as an interconnected web where everything helps everything else, and there's none of that kind of like individual fear of annihilation kind of thing. It's like as long as the whole group goes along together, and like we are all part of a single evolution of the human species or whatever, like those are two very different ways to view the world, and they will affect every single decision that you make all the way down. So anyone who grows up in that individual, like super individualistic, scarcity based mindset is going to take actions that are justified by that mindset 100%. And so, like, what the financial system does, whether anyone designed it to do this or not, like, it doesn't really matter, because that's the effect that it has, is bringing people up in a system where all they see is scarcity, and that's the air that they breathe, that's the water that they swim in, is this understanding of the world. And so any action that you take is that may be super corrupt, that may hurt other people, etc., is justified by that. Like, if I don't exploit someone, someone's going to exploit me, and that's, the way it
Yeah.
is.
And I think it's really useful to have these conversations, because we do need to start figuring out what components do we need to add to our education system in order to fight against this sort of inevitability of neoliberalism, which I hear is out now, according to the socialists, or what kind of support systems do we need in place for a CEO who manages a conglomerate? Because as you said, like that, it becomes such a huge thing when there's so much to lose that you do need to protect yourself so much and guard against the entropy. I love what you said. It's so true. So like, how do we put things in place to combat those kind of eventual self-protective instincts that are, of course, going to arise?
I think I have an answer. No, kind of. I mean, I think things like Simbi go a long way towards starting to get people out of that place. Obviously, like, people who aren't already open to that aren't really going to join Simbi, and so it's not going to solve the CEO's problem. But I do think that, like, more generally, the key is to give people who are in a scarcity-based mindset the experience of abundance, particularly like the human connection version. That's the only way to really, like, get people to change, is to make them realize that their previous assumptions weren't the only way to think about something. And that's the only way I've ever seen anyone change, is like they're, having a personal experience that to them is experienced as a miracle of some kind, like, even if it's not.
I totally agree with you. But going back to what you just said, that doesn't solve the problems for the CEOs, or that won't necessarily attract the CEOs or the politicians or the decision makers, oh my God, the influencers. So how do we because this is the thing, and I think you see this in society and in community, people that don't have much tend to be very generous with each other because they know what it's like to experience scarcity. We're social creatures. We're built to build relationships with one another. We enjoy having community. Lockdown, the pandemic has really, really proven that. So, like, generally speaking, your average Joe might, we might contain some of the pathology that could eventually become, the psychopathy of being extremely rich given the opportunity, but we're not the problem necessarily. So how do we solve that problem? How do we get to the decision makers?
Yeah,
how do we get them in alternative economies?
I don't think there is a force-based way to do it. I don't think there's like a generalizable plan that you can create to do that, because the problem isn't one of it isn't a cookie cutter problem. It's a different mental block for every single person that you talk to. It's like, it has to come from relating to them as a person and their particular, like, life experience. I mean, I know there's, like, gurus who go to CEOs of big companies, and it's almost become like a joke at this point, because they're like getting the CEO to meditate or whatever, and it's just kind of like hilarious. And that's why I say I don't think there is a cookie cutter kind of plan you can do to create that. I think what you can do is get 1 million people using something like Simbi, and then they have to start to notice, because of the way their existing incentives, like, make them think about it. And that's the point at which you can say, okay, what's different about this platform, and why is this platform succeeding in ways that might completely break your worldview or your expectation, right? But I don't think you can do it, like, before that. It's more like it's always a show versus tell, and showing is really hard and can take a long time at scale for the type of thing like Simbi is. It can happen very quickly on an individual basis, right? Like, a CEO could just meet someone at Burning Man that, like, changes their whole worldview, right? And that's happened many, many times. That doesn't mean every, like, revelation period that someone has is, like, going to fully get them there or anything. Like, that might have to happen a few times to someone in different contexts. But I've never seen or heard of anything other than just, like, a personal experience that changes people's assumptions about the world like that. It's just like they've had that experience constantly since they were a child, and unless you can, like, completely break that in their mind, like it's, it takes what they see as a miracle of some kind, or something that just like doesn't, like, miracle's a strong word, but it really just means like something that you don't have a pre-existing explanation for when you experience it. And that's what I'm getting at with them, is like, like these are people who have never been shown generosity in significant ways, in, in like certain ways that they might not realize, and I think it really comes down to that eventually. But in the meantime, we can build things like Simbi, and help other people experience abundance.
Just a side note, I don't know if you saw it. Abigail Disney wrote an op-ed. Can't remember where. Maybe the New Yorker. Explaining that she'd read the article about how Bezos for a couple of years didn't pay any taxes, and Musk the same, and she read how all of these tips and tricks, and she wrote this op-ed saying, these are the tips and tricks my accountants have been giving to me. Like, this is when you're raised in that world, this is seen as like morally justifiable. Like, it's literally the environment that you're raised in.
Exactly. It's the water you swim in.
Exactly. I thought it was very, very interesting. Have your users reached out to you and given you feedback that Simbi is affecting how they, or impacting how they see the world and how they exist in the world?
Absolutely. Over time, there's been tons and tons of people who have done both unsolicited and solicited testimonials for Simbi. There's probably 20 of them on Simbi's blog, that have been posted over the years. That was one of the main ways that the previous Simbi team was doing, like, kind of outreach, online marketing type stuff, is by posting those types of testimonials. And we're constantly getting thank yous and things like that from people, especially if we like launch a new feature that people weren't expecting, or that if you succeed in some way that people weren't expecting, then they're very appreciative. And the folks who are super active on Simbi and have been for a long time, they like all of them at some point have reached out to say thank you, and to be like, hey, how can we make this bigger?
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm just thinking of a couple of people actually that I would love to hook you up with.
Awesome.
Yeah. Who are not necessarily doing similar projects, but definitely out of the same kind of incentive or desire.
Cool.
Definitely ideology. David, I think that's actually, we're just hitting the hour mark. I think that's a lovely note to wrap up on.
Cool.
Thank you so much for your time. Tell me, who would you like to platform?
So the organization I'd like to platform is called Community Development Finance, and it is a nonprofit that exists in the Bay Area, California. They started a project called Community Check Cashing about 10 years ago, which was the first nonprofit check cashing store in America. So rates that are essentially just at cost for them, essentially the lowest cost lending you can get for people who can't go to banks essentially for anything. And then also super cheap check cashing for people who don't have bank accounts. And what this has done is allow them to kind of outcompete the for-profit check cashers in their area right there. So if I were to, and I actually went to experts in the check cashing and payday loan field and said, if you had $1 billion, what would you do? And they literally came back to me and said, I would expand this store's model nationwide. This one check cashing store, like literally $1 billion could drive out this extremely exploitative, usurious industry that extracts, billions from people every year. And it goes back to that conversation we were having about for-profit versus nonprofit incentives, and the difficulty of running a for-profit that has a mission in it. In this case, if you have a nonprofit check cashing and payday loan model, it massively outcompetes the for-profit model, because the for-profit model has to take profit, right? Like there's no way for the for-profit one to outcompete the nonprofit in this case, which is a good thing for everyone involved except the people who run the for-profit check cashing companies, right? And so I would love to see Community Development Finance get $1 billion to build out that model and just eliminate check cashing through market means, like not even having to make a law or restrict anything about how the bad lenders operate, you could just have nonprofit lending like be available for everyone, so no one would ever have to choose to go to a, someone who's going to screw them.
That's awesome. Let's help them get $1 billion.
Exactly. Find a way.
David, thank you so much for your time. It was a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. Me again. You can find Simbi at simbi.com. That's simbi.com, where you can sign up, become part of the community, start trading your skills or looking for skills, and trading those Simbi credits. I would highly recommend getting involved. I don't know about you, but I was really impressed with David's introduction on this episode. So go and have a look, and also head over to platformenterprise.com to sign up to get these podcast episodes and the occasional newsletter delivered to your inbox every week. All right. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast, everyone. See you next week.